The morning sun peeked through the street windows of Joe's diner, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. Ming worked her usual routine, gliding between tables with a coffee pot in one hand and a stack of menus in the other. Her regulars liked to joke that she could balance a whole Thanksgiving dinner on one arm, and truth be told, they weren't far off. The smell of fresh bacon and maple syrup filled the air as she refilled Mr. Wilson's cup for the third time that morning. He was always first in line when the diner opened, claiming his favorite spot by the window where he could watch the city wake up. "Thanks, dear," he mumbled from behind his newspaper, not looking up from the crossword puzzle he'd been working on for the past hour. Ming smiled, but her eyes drifted to the corner of the diner where an old upright piano sat collecting dust. Menus and napkin holders had made their home on its closed lid, transforming what was once a beautiful instrument into nothing more than an oversized shelf. Sometimes, when the diner was quiet, she could almost hear it calling to her, like an old friend waiting to reconnect. 10 years had passed since she last touched a piano. 10 years since that fateful evening at the National Music Competition where everything fell apart. She had been halfway through Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 when the notes began to blur together, her fingers turning to lead as panic seized her chest. The silence that followed her abrupt exit from the stage still echoed in her nightmares. "Order up." Uncle Lee's voice boomed from the kitchen, snapping Ming back to reality. She quickly grabbed the plates of steaming eggs and hash browns, pushing away memories of concert halls and polished grand pianos. This was her life now, memorizing orders instead of sheet music, mastering the art of carrying multiple plates instead of perfecting her fingering technique. The diner had become her sanctuary in an unexpected way. Here, nobody knew about her past as a child prodigy who practiced 6 hours a day. Nobody remembered the newspaper articles praising her talent or the prestigious music school scholarships she turned down. To them, she was just Ming, the reliable waitress who remembered how they liked their coffee and always had a kind word to spare. But some habits died hard. Her fingers still tapped out rhythms on the counter while she waited for orders, and she could hear music in the everyday sounds of the diner. The symphony of clinking plates, sizzling grills, and morning chatter. Sometimes, when she thought nobody was watching, she'd ghost her fingers over the edge of a table, playing invisible melodies that only she could hear. Mrs. Zhang, a retired teacher who came in every Tuesday for blueberry pancakes, caught her doing this once. "You've got musician's hands," she'd observed quietly, causing Ming to quickly pull them back, tucking them into her apron pockets. The knowing look in Mrs. Zhang's eyes had stayed with her for days. The morning rush was starting to pick up now. A group of office workers filed in, their laptops and tablets creating a modern contrast to the diner's vintage decor. Ming grabbed her notepad, ready to take their orders, but her gaze lingered on the piano for just a moment longer. A thin ray of sunlight had managed to pierce through the dust, illuminating the worn wood and bringing out hints of its former glory. Tomorrow, she'd bring some polish from home, she decided. Maybe clean off some of that dust, rescued from its fate as a glorified storage space. She wouldn't play it, of course. Those days were behind her. But something about seeing it so neglected made her heart ache in a way she wasn't quite ready to examine. "Ming," Uncle Lee called out again, this time with a touch of impatience in his voice. "Table 5's getting cold." She hurried back to work, pushing away thoughts of music and memories. But as she moved through her morning routine, muscle memory from years of training still guided her movements, turning each step into a dance, each task into a perfectly timed performance. Perhaps some things, once learned, could never truly be forgotten. The clock on the diner wall read 5:45 a.m. as Ming wiped down the counters, preparing for another day. The early morning silence wrapped around her like a comfortable blanket, broken only by the gentle hum of the refrigerator and Uncle Lee's quiet whistling from the kitchen as he prepped the morning's first batch of biscuits. She'd started coming in earlier lately, telling herself it was to get ahead on the morning prep work. But truthfully, These quiet moments before the breakfast rush had become precious to her. Just her, the sunrise, and the old piano in the corner that seemed to grow more magnetic with each passing day. This morning felt different, though. She'd overheard Uncle Lee talking on the phone the night before about making space for more tables. That old piano's just collecting dust anyway, he'd said. Might as well get rid of it, make room for paying customers. The words had stuck with her all night, keeping her tossing and turning in her small apartment above the convenience store. Now, as she finished wiping the last table, her feet carried her toward the piano almost without her permission. Her hand reached out, touching the dusty surface. 10 years of accumulated memories lay beneath her fingertips. She lifted the lid carefully, wincing at the slight creak. The keys, yellowed with age, still held their familiar pattern. Black and white. Simple. Unchanging. Just checking for dust, she whispered to herself, though no one was around to hear her excuse. Her finger pressed down on middle C, so softly it barely made a sound. The note, though slightly flat from years of neglect, sent a shiver down her spine. Before she could stop herself, her other hand joined in. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major flowed from her fingers, muscle memory taking over. It was like riding a bicycle. Her body remembered even if her mind had tried to forget. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to dance with the music as she played. Each note awakened something inside her that had been sleeping for far too long. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing deepened, and for the first time in years, she felt truly present in her own skin. She didn't hear Uncle Lee come out of the kitchen. Didn't notice him standing in the doorway, flower still on his apron, watching with wide eyes as his quiet waitress transformed before him. The simple diner filled with music that belonged in concert halls, yet somehow felt perfectly at home among the coffee cups and syrup dispensers. The final notes of the nocturne faded away, leaving behind a silence that felt electric. Ming's hands were trembling as she pulled them away from the keys, reality crashing back in. That's when she heard the slow clapping. She spun around to find Uncle Lee leaning against the doorframe, a gentle smile on his weathered face. "In all these years," he said softly, "you never mentioned you could play." Ming felt her cheeks burn. I don't anymore. Haven't for a long time." She straightened her apron, trying to regain her composure. "I'm sorry if I disturbed your morning prep." Uncle Lee walked over to the piano, running his hand along its worn surface. "You know, my late wife used to say that talents are like plants. You can try to ignore them, but if they're meant to grow, they'll find a way through the concrete." He paused, looking thoughtful. "I was going to have this old thing taken away next week. Make room for more tables." He chuckled at Ming's stricken expression. "But maybe what this place needs isn't more tables. Maybe it needs more music." Ming opened her mouth to protest, but Uncle Lee held up his hand. "Just think about it. No pressure. But that was the most alive I've seen you look since you started working here." He headed back to the kitchen, then stopped. "Oh, and Ming? The biscuits need another 5 minutes. Why don't you play something else while you wait?" She stood frozen for a moment, torn between running away and sitting back down. The morning sun caught the dust motes dancing in the air, making them look like tiny stars swirling around the piano. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the city beginning to wake up. Slowly, almost reverently, Ming sat back down at the piano. This time, her fingers found a different melody, something gentler, like a conversation between old friends who had finally found their way back to each other. Word spread through the neighborhood like honey dripping from a spoon, slow at first, then all at once. It started with Mr. Wilson, who'd been there that first morning when Ming returned to the piano. He mentioned it to his bridge club, and soon their regular Tuesday afternoon table grew from 4 players to 8, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the musical waitress. The lunch crowd changed to 2. Instead of rushing back to their offices, people lingered over their coffee, stealing glances at the now polished piano in the corner. Little notes started appearing with the tips. Could you play something happy? My mother loved Beethoven. Do you know any jazz? Ming found herself drawn to the piano more and more during quiet moments. Sometimes it was just a few notes between refilling coffee cups. Other times a full piece during her break. The music seemed to add something special to the diner's atmosphere, like salt bringing out the flavor in a favorite dish. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, an elderly man in a worn tweed jacket came in, ordered a slice of apple pie, and sat quietly in the corner. Ming noticed his fingers tapping along as she played during her break, keeping perfect time. After she finished, he waved her over. That's some mighty fine playing, he said, his voice warm like aged whiskey. Been watching those hands of yours. They've got stories to tell. He introduced himself as Mr. Chen, a retired music teacher from the community college. Ming felt her guard go up slightly. I just play a little, for fun, she said, already starting to step back toward the safety of her serving duties. But Mr. Chen just smiled and shook his head. Music isn't about grades or competitions, young lady. It's about making people feel something. And let me tell you, when you played the Chopin just now, I felt every note right here. He patted his chest. That conversation marked a turning point. Mr. Chen became a regular, coming in 3 times a week, always ordering the same slice of apple pie. He'd sit in his corner, sometimes sharing stories about his years of teaching, sometimes just listening. He never pushed or pressured, just offered gentle encouragement and the occasional suggestion. The diner's regulars developed their own favorites. Mrs. Zhang loved Debussy, saying it reminded her of rain on bamboo leaves. The morning construction crew always requested upbeat jazz numbers, their work-worn boots tapping under the tables. Even grumpy old Mr. Peterson, who complained about everything from the coffee temperature to the weather, would stop mid-grumble when Ming played Moonlight Sonata. One morning, a young mother came in with her little girl, who couldn't have been more than 6. The child stood transfixed by the piano, her small hands mimicking Ming's movements in the air. During a quiet moment, Ming invited her to sit at the piano, showing her how to play a simple melody with one finger. The girl's face lit up like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Mama, look, I'm making music," she exclaimed, her joy pure and unconditional. Ming felt something shift inside her chest, remembering when she'd once felt that same simple happiness at a piano. Uncle Lee watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. He'd started keeping the piano tuned and even hung a small spotlight above it. Good business sense, he'd say with a wink whenever Ming tried to thank him. Happy customers stay longer and order more pie. But Ming knew it was more than that. The music had brought something special to their little corner of the world. It wasn't about perfection anymore, or about impressing anyone. It was about the way Mr. Wilson's shoulders would relax when she played his favorite Gershwin tune, or how the young mother would close her eyes for just a moment during a quiet classical piece, finding a brief respite in her busy day. The piano, once buried under menus and dust, had become the heart of the diner. And somewhere along the way, Ming realized she'd stopped thinking about that failed competition from 10 years ago. The music had found its way back to her, not in a grand concert hall, but in this humble diner where every day brought its own kind of magic. The bell above the diner door chimed on a busy Thursday afternoon. Ming was in the middle of pouring coffee when she heard it, just another sound in the everyday symphony of the diner. But something made her look up, and the coffee nearly overflowed the cup. Standing in the doorway was a tall woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing an expensive-looking gray suit that seemed out of place among the diner's casual atmosphere. Ming would have recognized her anywhere. Mrs. Wang, her former piano teacher, the woman who had shaped her childhood with equal measures of brilliance and ruthlessness. Ming's hands began to shake. Mr. Wilson, noticing her distress, quietly took the coffee pot from her trembling fingers. "I've got this, dear," he whispered, giving her arm a gentle pat. Mrs. Wang's eyes scanned the diner until they found Ming. Her expression was unreadable as she made her way to the counter, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. I hardly believed it when I heard, Mrs. Wang said by way of greeting. My former star pupil, the one who was destined for Carnegie Hall, playing in a... She paused, looking around. A diner. Ming straightened her apron, trying to steady her voice. Would you like to order something, Mrs. Wang? Don't be ridiculous, Mrs. Wang replied. I'm here because my colleague saw you playing the other day. She actually thought you were quite good, in a rustic sort of way. She made it sound like an accusation rather than a compliment. The lunch crowd had gone quiet, sensing the tension. Even the sizzle of the grill in the kitchen seemed muted. Uncle Lee appeared in the doorway, dish towel in hand, watching carefully. You had such potential, Mrs. Wang continued, each word precise and cutting. All those years of training, the competitions you won, the sacrifices your parents made, and you threw it all away because of one little setback. Ming felt heat rising in her cheeks. It wasn't just a setback, she said quietly, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. It was my breaking point. She thought back to those endless hours of practice, the constant pressure to be perfect, the way every note had to be exactly right or it wasn't right at all. How music had slowly transformed from joy to torture, each piece becoming a mountain of expectations she had to climb. Do you know what I remember most about that competition? Ming continued, her voice growing stronger. Not the moment I froze. Not the whispers from the audience. I remember sitting in my car afterward, realizing I couldn't remember the last time I'd played just for the love of it. Mr. Chen, who had been sitting quietly in his usual corner, stood up. I've been listening to this young lady play for weeks now, he said, his gentle voice carrying across the diner. And I can tell you something about her music that you seem to have forgotten, Mrs. Wang. It has heart. Mrs. Wang turned, startled by this interruption. And who might you be? Just an old music teacher who knows that technique without soul is like a body without breath. He smiled at Ming. Play something for us, dear. Play what you feel right now. Ming looked around the diner. She saw Uncle Lee's encouraging nod, Mr. Wilson's kind eyes, the young mother from yesterday holding her little girl close. These people had become her family, this diner her home. And suddenly, she knew exactly what to play. She sat down at the piano and began a piece she'd been working on privately, her own arrangement of a classic melody, woven through with bits of jazz and contemporary elements. It wasn't perfect by competition standards, but it was honest. It was hers. As she played, she could feel Mrs. Wang's critical gaze, could almost hear her former teacher's mental notes about incorrect fingering or unorthodox interpretations. But for the first time, those imagined criticisms didn't matter. The music flowed from somewhere deeper than technique, somewhere that rules couldn't reach. When the last note faded, the diner erupted in applause. Ming turned to find Mrs. Wang still standing there, her expression now something closer to confusion than disapproval. It's not traditional, Mrs. Wang said finally, but... She paused, as if the next words were difficult to say. Perhaps tradition isn't everything. As her former teacher turned to leave, Ming felt a weight lift from her shoulders, one she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying all these years. She looked at her hands, calloused now from carrying plates as much as playing piano, and smiled. These weren't the hands of a failed concert pianist. They were the hands of someone who had found her own way to make music sing. After Mrs. Wang's visit, something shifted in the way Ming approached the piano. It was as if a door that had been barely cracked open now swung wide, letting in fresh air and sunlight. The music flowed more freely, no longer bound by the chains of perfectionism that had held her back for so long. One quiet afternoon, Mr. Chen sat at his usual corner table, sipping tea and watching Ming play during her break. The melody she chose was playful, mixing classical techniques with popular tunes in a way that made several customers smile. You know, he said when she finished, there's something special happening here. It's not just music you're making, it's connections. Ming wiped down the table next to him, thinking about his words. She'd noticed how the atmosphere in the diner had changed over the past weeks. Strangers started talking to each other, sharing stories between bites of pie. The rushed lunch crowd took time to breathe, to listen, to enjoy their meals. The little girl who'd been fascinated by the piano. Everyone called her Little Sunshine because of her bright smile, came in regularly now with her mother. That day, she tugged on Ming's apron while she was clearing dishes. "Can you show me how to play again?" she asked, eyes hopeful. "Please." Ming looked at Uncle Lee, who nodded with a knowing smile. "Take your break now," he said. "I'll cover your tables." She sat down with Little Sunshine at the piano, showing her how to position her small hands on the keys. "Music is like telling a story," Ming explained, helping her pick out a simple melody. "Each note is a word, and when you put them together, they can say anything you want." The child's face lit up with each successful note, her joy pure and unconditional. Ming remembered feeling that same excitement once, before competitions and expectations had clouded everything. Teaching, she realized, was helping her rediscover that simple pleasure. Word got around about Ming's impromptu lessons. Soon, other parents started asking if she would teach their children. Even some adults, inspired by the music that now filled the diner, expressed interest in learning. "Why not start a proper program?" Mr. Chen suggested one day. "Nothing fancy, just afternoon lessons for anyone who wants to learn. Music should be shared, not hoarded." The idea took root in Ming's mind. She started offering basic lessons twice a week after the lunch rush, using the diner's piano. Uncle Lee supported the idea wholeheartedly, saying it brought in business during usually quiet hours. But the real magic happened in unexpected moments. Like when Mrs. Zhang, who always said her fingers were too stiff for piano, finally managed to play "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" and burst into tears of joy. Or when a tough-looking teenager, initially dragged to lessons by his grandmother, discovered he had a natural talent for jazz. Mr. Chen became a regular fixture during these sessions, offering gentle guidance to both Ming and her students. "Teaching isn't about making perfect musicians," he told her. "It's about helping people find their own voice." Ming understood what he meant more with each passing day. She watched her students, each one approaching the piano differently, each one finding their own way to make it sing. Some had natural talent, others struggled with basic scales, but all of them brought something unique to the music. One evening, after everyone had gone home, Ming sat at the piano alone. The setting sun painted the diner in warm orange light, and the usual sounds of dishes and coffee cups had given way to peaceful quiet. She began to play, not any particular piece, but something that came from her heart. The melody spoke of her journey, the pain of her past, the warmth of her diner family, the joy of sharing music with others. Her fingers danced across the keys, telling a story of healing and redemption, of finding purpose in unexpected places. Uncle Lee, who had been counting the day's receipts, paused to listen. "You know," he said when she finished, "sometimes the best things in life happen when we stop trying to force them, and just let them unfold naturally." Ming looked at the piano, its surface now gleaming with care, no longer buried under menus and dust. Like her, it had been given a second chance, a new purpose. And together, they were creating something beautiful, not just music, but a community, a place where everyone could feel welcome to discover their own song. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between bills and advertisements. Uncle Lee stood in his small office at the back of the diner, reading and rereading it until the words blurred together. When he finally emerged, his face looked older than Ming had ever seen it. "Everything okay?" she asked, noticing how his hands trembled slightly as he tied his apron. He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The landlord's selling the building," he said quietly. They're giving us 3 months to either buy it or move out. The price. He shook his head. It might be time to think about retiring. The news spread through the diner like a winter chill. This place wasn't just a restaurant. It was a second home to so many people. Mr. Wilson had been coming here for his morning coffee for 20 years. Mrs. Zhang celebrated her 70th birthday at that corner table. And now, the music that had brought new life to these old walls might fall silent. Ming couldn't sleep that night. She lay awake in her apartment, thinking about all the memories wrapped up in that building. The way Little Sunshine's face lit up during her piano lessons. The laughter of the construction workers during their lunch breaks. The peaceful moments in the early morning when it was just her and the piano, sharing secrets in melody. The next day, during the afternoon lull, she sat at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys. Instead of playing, she found herself thinking about something Mr. Chen had said weeks ago about music bringing people together. Suddenly, she stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "Uncle Lee," she called out, hurrying to his office. "What if we could save the diner?" He looked up from his paperwork, confusion crossing his tired face. "Unless you've got a hidden fortune somewhere." "Not money," she said, her mind racing ahead of her words. "Community. Music. What if we transformed the diner into something new? Not just a place to eat, but a place where food and music come together." The idea tumbled out of her. Evening performances, weekend jazz brunches, an actual stage for local musicians. They could move some tables around, create a proper performance space. The piano wouldn't just be in the corner anymore, it would be the heart of everything. Uncle Lee listened, his expression changing from skepticism to curiosity. "It would take a lot of work," he said slowly, "and money we don't have." But word had already spread. Mr. Wilson overheard their conversation and immediately offered to talk to his friends at the local business association. Mrs. Zhang knew someone who could help with renovations. Even grumpy Mr. Peterson surprised everyone by mentioning his nephew was a sound engineer who might be interested in helping. The next few weeks became a whirlwind of activity. The community rallied around them in ways nobody expected. A local carpenter offered to build a proper stage. Mr. Chen brought in musician friends to test the acoustics. The construction workers who came for lunch volunteered their weekends to help with repairs. Little Sunshine's mother, who worked in marketing, designed beautiful posters announcing the diner's transformation into Uncle's Music Cafe. The young teenager who had discovered his love for jazz through Ming's lessons offered to help set up social media accounts. They worked during off hours, moving furniture, painting walls, running new electrical lines for stage lighting. Every day brought new challenges, but also new helpers. People who had never spoken to each other beyond casual greetings were now working side by side, sharing stories and dreams for the space. One evening, as Ming wiped down the new stage area, she found Uncle Lee standing by the piano, running his hand along its polished surface. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when my wife and I first opened this place, we wanted it to be more than just somewhere to eat. We wanted it to be somewhere people felt at home." He looked around at the half-finished renovations, the new paint still drying on the walls. "I think we're finally getting there." Ming looked at the space with fresh eyes. The diner's classic charm remained, but now it felt more alive, more purposeful. The piano no longer seemed out of place. Instead, everything else had grown to match its music. The transformation wasn't just about saving a business. It was about preserving a place where people could come together, share meals, and now, share music. A place where a waitress could rediscover her passion, where a child could learn their first notes, where an old man could find new purpose in teaching others. Opening night at Uncle's Music Cafe arrived with a buzz of excitement in the air. The renovation was complete, transforming the old diner into something both familiar and new. The classic chrome-edged tables still gleamed, but now they faced a small stage where the piano sat proudly under soft spotlight. String lights twinkled overhead, casting a warm glow that made everything feel magical. Ming stood in the kitchen doorway, watching people file in. She was still wearing her waitress uniform, but now it was paired with a simple black blazer, a gift from Mrs. Zhang for the special occasion. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the fabric. "Nervous?" Uncle Lee asked, appearing beside her with a pot of his famous coffee. "Terrified," she admitted with a small laugh. "What if nobody likes the changes? What if I mess up the performance?" He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Look around," he said softly. The cafe was filling up quickly. Mr. Wilson had brought his entire bridge club. The construction workers who'd helped with renovations sat at the counter in their best shirts. Little Sunshine bounced excitedly in her seat, wearing a party dress for the occasion. Even some of Ming's adult piano students had come, their faces glowing with pride for their teacher. Mr. Chen arrived last, using his cane to make his way to his usual corner spot, which now had a small, reserved sign on it. But he wasn't alone. To Ming's surprise, he was accompanied by Mrs. Wang, her former piano teacher. Ming's stomach did a flip, but Mrs. Wang's usual stern expression had softened somewhat. She nodded in Ming's direction, then took a seat next to Mr. Chen. At exactly 7 o'clock, Uncle Lee stepped onto the small stage. The casual chatter died down as he cleared his throat into the microphone. "When I first bought this diner," he began, his voice warm and sincere, "my wife told me that good food feeds the body, but music feeds the soul. I didn't understand what she meant back then." He paused, looking around the room. "But thanks to a very special person, I do now." He gestured to Ming, and suddenly all eyes were on her. She felt her cheeks flush as she made her way to the piano. Sitting down, she took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. The piece she prepared was special, something she'd been working on for months. It started with a classical foundation, then wove in elements of everything she'd learned and experienced over the past year. There were hints of the jazz the construction workers loved, touches of the simple melodies she taught her students, and moments of pure emotion that came straight from her heart. As she played, she could feel the room breathing with her. Mr. Wilson closed his eyes, swaying gently. Little Sunshine watched with wide-eyed wonder. Even Mrs. Wang leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. The final notes of her piece faded into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Little Sunshine jumped up, clapping wildly, and the room erupted in applause. What followed was better than any dream Ming could have imagined. Local musicians who'd heard about the cafe took turns performing. Mr. Chen played a beautiful jazz piece that had everyone tapping their feet. Some of Ming's students performed a simple group piece they practiced in secret, beaming with pride. Later in the evening, Ming found herself back at the piano, this time playing softly while serving coffee and pie between songs. She caught sight of her reflection in the piano's polished surface. She was smiling, really smiling, in a way she hadn't done in years. Mrs. Wang approached her during a quiet moment. "It's not Carnegie Hall," she said, looking around the cafe. "No," Ming agreed, straightening up. "It's better." And it was. This wasn't just a place where music happened. It was a place where music brought people together. Where a cup of coffee could come with a side of Mozart, where children could dream of playing their first song, where even the grumpiest customer could find a moment of joy in an unexpected melody. Uncle Lee was right. Good food fed the body, but music fed the soul. And here, in this transformed diner, where she'd found her second chance, Ming had finally learned to nourish both. As the evening wound down, she played one last piece, the same Chopin nocturne that had started it all. But this time, she played it not as a memory of what she'd lost, but as a celebration of what she'd found. The piano sang under her fingers, its voice mixing with the quiet conversations, the clink of coffee cups, and the sound of people simply being together. This, she realized, was her Carnegie Hall. Not a grand concert stage, but a humble cafe where every day brought its own kind of magic, where every note she played was a gift both given and received, where music wasn't about perfection, but about connection. And that was the most beautiful song of all.